Hello, everyone, and welcome back for our next block of presenters. Next up, we have Mr. Andy Driesman, our keynote speaker here at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. Mr. Andrew S. Driesman is the managing executive of the space exploration sector here. He has extensive experience in program and organizational management, as well as systems engineering of complex space systems. He oversees the technical and science staff within the SES and is responsible for strategic efforts within the organization to assure alignment with the vision and strategic plans of the sector and APL. As the nation's largest university-affiliated research center, APL performs research and development on behalf of the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and other federal agencies. The laboratory has more than 8,000 staff members who make critical contributions to a wide variety of nationally and globally significant technical and scientific challenges. Andy, thanks so much for joining us here this afternoon, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Let me take a moment and thank everybody, particularly Brandon and Chris, for inviting me to this talk, as well as for those who are on the Zoom here listening. It struck me as a little odd when Brandon approached me to ask that I am completely influent or unfluent in software, and to ask me to talk to a flight software workshop. I viewed it as sort of a unique opportunity. You won't see any code or anything resembling state diagrams in this discussion. But I did want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's management and leadership considerations when people are the most valuable resource. And really try to take a humanistic approach to leadership, something that I believe is more and more needed in this day and age, and sometimes considered a luxury. So with the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just the agenda. I'm gonna talk a little bit about where this talk came from, a bit about me, focus on staff and people and the relationship to work, and then take the next step on how to really enable and get the best out of your staff, and try to get it to some uncomfortable truths that really drive some of the environment that we live in. Okay, next slide. So genesis of the talk, to state the obvious, so Brandon Haber and Chris Heisted asked me to do this. And I'm not stating the obvious just to be flippant here, but I get a lot of requests, and my calendar looks like many of your other calendars, very busy. But I believe in the mission and the journey that Brandon and Chris are taking through life. And any way I can find to support them, I'd like to take the opportunity to do so. So here I am talking to you about management and leadership. I've been doing this, so I'm not one to believe the person to hide their age. I'm 58, and so I've been in the industry for 30 plus years, and really in leadership and management roles for 20 years. And I believe I've learned a lot. I've been blessed with a number of opportunities and a lot of success. I believe I have something to share, and as I sort of think about doing something else. Giving back is something very important to me. The lecture here is, like many things, there's some recycled material that I tried to build into some new thoughts, but it's based on a lecture I gave at the University of Michigan. I would call it an experimental lecture, where I really tried to I'm an engineer by trade, and I really tried to sit down and think about management leadership from a feedback control perspective. I've given several talks to National Academies of Sciences, Space Studies Board, as well as some of the decadal committees, really looking at why Parker Solar Probe, which was my last program management job, was successful, and try to pull out lessons learned. And then at APL, we have a number of things we call strategic mentoring cohorts. And the strategic mentoring cohorts are really aimed at mid-level leadership in the sector, people looking to take the next step. They're sort of the best and the brightest, and giving them access and opportunity to senior leadership for discussion. So the themes throughout these 3 lectures really lent themselves to this discussion. And then lastly, another thank you. I'm not a person who, pops up in the morning and says, hey, I want to give a lecture, or I want to write a book, or I want to write a paper. I do need a push. So thank you all for pushing me a bit. Next slide, please. So just quickly about me, you can probably tell by the photo on the upper right, I was a child of the late 60s. I'm sorry, the early 60s. Grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Normally that's where I stop because so much of the New York City person, it really defines me. And it's things that I've tried to accentuate over the years, as well as frankly, things I've tried to manage. I've got degrees at Tufts University, Bachelor of Science, Electrical Engineering and Geology, 2 very disparate disciplines that I've been lucky enough to combine, throughout my career, having worked for what was the Air Force Geophysics Labs and now APL, where we have a conglomeration of engineering and science that's just a wonderful place to be. I started working, I graduated in '85, worked for the US Air Force for a while, worked for the Electronic Systems Center for less than a year for my very first job, and decided that wasn't for me. And I entered a mentoring program, which is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about mentoring, and ended up moving on to look for other opportunities. Air Force Research Labs, worked on balloons, sounding rockets, and satellites. And I guess the hallmark of that was the quick turnaround experiences. So I was there from '85 to '97, so that's 12 years. And I probably worked end to end at least 10 different types of flight programs. Air Force Lab was moving to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I didn't want to go there. So my wife and I, we drew a line from Boston to DC to Chicago and back to Boston and said, hey, this is the area we want to live. It's got the right climate. And I ended up at APL. Stereo, where I joined APL and soon became the lead engineer for a mission called Stereo. It was a national mission launched in 2006 to do stereoscopic imaging and particle detection of the sun. Supervised the systems engineering group at APL. And then I took a diversion in my career and went to NOAA for a year, where I was the technical director of the Joint Polar Satellite System. Came back to APL, program manager for Parker Solar Probe, which is really, for me, a seminal experience in my life. Launched successfully, closest approach to the sun of any human created object, and fastest, and making new discoveries every day. I'm our program manager, Dragonfly flight system manager, and then settled into the space exploration sector managing executive, where I had the privilege of managing the care and feeding for about 1,200 staff members at APL. And so I've sort of bounced through my career, moving back and forth between program management, senior leadership, and line management. And it's a great career, and I'm looking forward to the remainder of it. Next slide, please. So people. As I thought about it, okay, so we like to say people are the most critical resource in an organization. Is that true? I think for some organizations, probably not, but I think for certainly my organization, and as I'm quickly scanning down the where-tos of people on the call here, likely for your organization as well. So as I thought about under what conditions are people the most critical resource, the first thing is when people aren't a commodity. And that word is not really meant to be disparaging, but there are places in the economic world where, labor is unskilled and people could be moved in and out relatively easy. That happens to not be my business. Where innovation is necessary. So APL is an organization that lives and dies on being innovative. I think that's true of much of the technical world. And innovation, in my experience, really only comes from people. Perspective, interpretation of context, and subtle action is required. So, this sort of gets at the as we transition many things to either machine learning or AI or various other computational things. They talk about, software taking over many of the next level jobs in our food chain. We're not at a place where the understanding the human mind and the subtleties associated are within the domain of computational systems. And then where revenues are dependent on people. So APL is not an organization that's IP heavy. We have unique facilities, but not a lot of them. And what we're really selling is the capability of our people, the fact that our people are sort of act as one based on a very unique, what I consider unique culture. And then the fact that I believe APL has an interesting perspective on risk. So for the high tech or the IT crowd, I think people are the answer is people are the most critical resource almost always. And then APL, for those of you unfamiliar, it meets all the criteria I just stated above. And we're often dependent on the critical staff more than they are dependent on us. So I think of myself, I'm much more dependent on the staff that I work with rather than they are dependent on me. Next slide, please. So, people are necessary, but geez, they're messy. And I do mean to be a little tongue in cheek here, but people are people. They're wonderful to work with, yet they're not machines. They need to eat. They make errors. They sleep. They're cranky. They need coffee. They get sloppy. They make mistakes. They quit. They do all sorts of things that are things that are just the reality of working as a member of the human society. And then they populate every dimension of the organization. So if we talk about organizations in terms of org charts and staffing charts, and they're all people. We rarely talk about organizations in terms of how a product flows through them. And so the reality is you've got this juxtaposition, and you've got an organization that's success is dependent on the people or staff, and then you've got all these other things that need to be managed. And no, you can't just, anytime somebody gets sick or injured, because they're so critical and they're so unique in their capabilities, you can't just go hire another one. So you have to manage all around all this stuff. And if you don't do it, organizations fail. And I think that they fail, but often something else is blamed. So they'll blame an economic downturn or something else, but often we didn't really think about how we're managing our people and being predictive about how we manage them. Next slide, please. To make matters worse, what you see here, and I pulled just a piece out of a schedule for a large mission. This happens to be Parker Solar Probe, and I blew it up. And you see here certain aspects of the schedule. And when you think about something being built or something being fabricated, it could be a software product, it could be a radio, it could be any one of a number of things that actually have either virtual physicality or real physicality. The only people who are pushing that product forward are the people who are really, you would think, at the bottom of the org chart. So me as a manager, whether it's a line manager, executive manager, or program manager, there's nothing I do in my day-to-day that actually makes that product move forward. It's the person with their hands on the keyboard. It's the person with the wrench in their hands. It's the person who's laying out a circuit board. It's the person who is moving that board from one location to another. Those are the people who actually do the work. And all we get to do as leaders is clear the paths, assure that we're building the right thing, and provide the guidance necessary. So not only are we dependent on the people, and the people are messy, but we don't make any progress without them at the lowest level of the organization. Next slide, please. To make matters even worse, this is a perspective that I pulled together actually for one of the National Academy briefs. It was on a much prettier slide, but I cut and pasted it into this. Is that what you see here is just a really top-down organization. At the top is NASA headquarters, NASA Science Mission Directorate. At the bottom, you have the engineering, science, and technical staff that move the product forward. And in between, you have different management levels. If a failure happens, so let's say if we use a satellite and something happens where you delay a launch, say a piece of code fails to work as expected, or an item under test breaks, it delays the launch. Okay. For something like Parker Solar Probe, which I was the program manager, the next launch date was probably a $200 million slip. Or God forbid something worse happens and we have an issue on orbit where a mission fails. You can look back to some of the Mars missions in the 90s, or some of our own experiences at APL where we've had failures. The engineer or scientist or technician who may have been maybe the closest to the failure, they have a really bad day. It's real tough. They'll be harder on themselves than anybody else are. But in the end, they will ultimately just move on to the next job. If you rise to the other extreme and look at the head of NASA Science Mission Directorate, they could lose their job. They could lose their whole portfolio. Their portfolio could be delayed. Having a couple $100 million of unexpected costs in the middle of a program can cause delays in the whole portfolio of a significant branch of NASA, or it can you could lose political favor. So we're all watching JWST and knocking wood. If JWST had a problem, James Webb Space Telescope had a problem on that flyout, that would have been a significant political issue at NASA, and the whole portfolio with an SMD likely would have stalled because of the loss of political goodwill. So we're in a situation here where the greatest impact of a problem is at the top, yet the people who are most able to fix or prevent or correct that problem are all the way at the bottom. And so now when I started drawing this, I said, okay, this is why people micromanage, right? Because you as a manager have all the risk, you have no control. And I think that understanding that and managing this sort of aspect is a key for people who are in leadership positions. Because there's always somebody above you who has more on the table than you do. And there's always somebody below you who can actually affect things in a positive manner. So being able to develop the trust and communications with an organization that's up and out and down and in is absolutely critical in order to stay aligned in moving a product forward. Next slide, please. So what do we do all about this, right? So we've got a situation where, we need people are messy. They're making, they could, and that the responsibility for those potential problems is so disconnected from the people who are actually doing the work. Next slide, please. So the first is, maybe we're thinking about things wrong, right? So I didn't come up with this idea of an inverted org chart. It actually goes back probably to the 70s to Scandinavian Airlines or Nordstrom's, the department store use this model, but maybe we're thinking about it wrong. If you think about it in an inverted way, and you go back to the statement I made where the only people who are pushing the product forward are at the bottom of the org chart, maybe we need to think about it that we as leaders actually work for the staff that are under us, right? Or over us. I'm getting, having trouble with, my own personal navigation here. But maybe we have responsibility to the staff who are working for us in order to make sure that we're enabling them to be successful. So we, in many ways, serve our employees. We serve the broader organization. And it gets you this idea of what I would call, and I didn't coin this phrase, but I can attribute it, of servant leadership, where we're enablers. We step into the background. We're the glue between our bosses and the people actually doing the work. And we're putting the people doing the work at the forefront of our thought process. I didn't want this to be a statement where, hey, if you just listen to what the people say, then everything will be fine. That's definitely not the case, because leaders must also lead. We're responsible for tone setting, direction setting, inspiring workforces, advocating for the product that's being built as well as the staff building the product, making sure the resources are there. The person with their soldering iron on a circuit board has no way of necessarily assuring that the resources that allow them to do their job are present. And then making sure that the environment around them is conducive to success. And then there are often difficult decisions to be made. We don't want to be pushing difficult decisions down. We need to own our decisions. So, when you have limited resources, or you have situations where resources need to be shifted, those often yield difficult conversations. And it's our responsibility as the leaders to make sure that happens. So it's this doppelganger effect where, at times in your life as a leader, you got to look at the org chart, the traditional manner, but many times it pays to flip it and look at it as if you were, serving the team under you. Next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to get in this model is the staff empowerment. I think to a great extent, management and leadership is shifting power around in a room. When you walk into a room and you're, I'm the managing executive of a 1,300 person organization, or you're a head of a project or anything, you come into that room with innate power, right? Because you've been granted this title. But I would argue most of the time, that's not where you want the power to be. You want the power in the hands of people who could actually be innate, who could actually make decisions. And I would even say it's critical. This little sort of feedback control loop was my playing with the idea of, drawing a feedback system around a management construct. But for those of you familiar with feedback control systems, one of the deaths of a control system is latency. So if you have a large organization and you have work being done at a low level, and then something happens, by the time you as a leader find out about it and can act, your data is stale, and you're probably doing something wrong because the situation has changed. You just don't know it. So by pushing down decision and authority as low in an organization you help shorten those comm lines and reduce latency, thus building a more accurate and efficient system. The conference room table there was just a nod to it's even the small things. It's a typical conference room chair. There's a head of the table there, and then you've got whatever, 10 other seats around it. And I have taken to, when I sit down in a room, and I did this subconsciously, but then realized sort of the power of it. You know, I will never sit at the head of the table because the conversation is not about me, right? I innately have this power walking in the room. The conversation is not what it takes to make me happy. The conversation is about what it is to fix the problem. So you want to empower the staff around you. So typically, I'll walk into a conference room and I'll sit at one of the side tables, and it's funny how, particularly when I'm meeting with new people, how somebody will walk in and that's the only seat that's empty, and they won't sit there. They'll go either stand or find some other place to sit, and I'll drag them back in and say, no, you sit there. You know, we're all working in the same direction here, but it's a bit of human psychology. Next slide, please. The idea of leadership has, I guess, been established through the years by, I think of it as, we like our heroes, right? And so, everything from Superman to Wonder Woman, or whoever, pick your hero or heroine, the football player, the basketball player, and we always talk about them as individuals, and then sometimes we talk about them as a team. I think as you move up in leadership, the jobs that are being asked of you are well beyond the capability of a single person to have the correct skill set to execute. I certainly feel that at my job here, and almost everybody I've spoken to who are in positions of leadership, it's like, you are who you are, and you continue to try to grow and change yourself, but you're only a single entity, albeit multi-dimensions. But there's many, many more dimensions that are required about leadership. So we talk about leadership teams. And so there's often a desire and this is human nature, is, okay, I'm going to go work with somebody I like. I'm going to go work with somebody who's like me, that I connect with, that I have a repartee with, that I know. And I would argue that, okay, some of that is fine, but be really careful. You want somebody who's got a complementary skill set, that thinks differently than you, that will argue with you, that will challenge your perceptions. I like to say, I know what's in my head. Don't tell me what I know. Tell me what's in your head and what I don't know. And through that process, I think you build a much broader base and are better able to execute. On Parker, when I joined the Parker Solar Probe team, the mission was going through some very difficult times. And I joined the team after it was formed, so I became the program manager, and there was a deputy in place. And about a year later, I switched gears. We did a slight reorg, and I got a different deputy. I didn't get a different deputy because the original deputy was not fine. He was actually a great program manager, but he was too much like me, and we couldn't cover the waterfront necessary. So brought someone in who was a very different manager than I'm not your classical program manager. I brought somebody in who was a classical program manager who understood contracts and put them in to focus on execution, the work. And I was able to do the relationship building and the looking of 3 to 6 months out, where in an effort to get ahead of the problem. So getting the right people on your team is paramount, even if it takes, frankly, breaking a few eggs. You should not be shy away from that. It's our responsibilities to the organization to assure that we have a team that's executing well, and that leadership has got enough strength to be able to support that. Next slide, please. A word about building your team. And I'm sure there's a wide variety of businesses represented in the organization. We build spacecraft in my portion of APL, And building spacecraft is hard because ultimately you're dominated by, particularly planetary missions, you're dominated by laws of physics. You don't get to say when something launches. It's the laws of physics that tell you when you can launch. And if you miss a certain launch window, it could be 2 years or 5 years later and hundreds of millions of dollars if you miss it. So this was, I just pulled a time card, and this was not uncommon. You know, APL's got an 80-hour work time card. You can see 142 hours there. And that was not uncommon in that stage of the game. And as I was thinking about this, you know, there's a difference between tired and exhaustion. Tired is something you go to bed, you rest, you come back, you're less tired. Exhausted is an emotional state, and it's very hard to recover from. And the team as a whole always seemed to have the energy necessary to solve some very difficult problems that continue to hit us late in the game. And then years later, I was driving down to, we were going down to the Eastern Shore of Virginia on a COVID holiday, meaning it was just us in a house we had rented, me and my wife, and she had on David White, who's an Anglo-English poet. And he was telling us some story about, you know, when he was at a difficult time in his life, and he was talking with a Benedictine monk friend, and he made the statement, you know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. And that struck me in terms of team inspiration. The team has to be wholeheartedly invested in what they're doing. And that emotional state is what keeps exhaustion at bay. As I mentioned, exhaustion is a state of mind. It's that has physical representations. But if you can get a team that's wholeheartedly invested, inspired, aspired in what you are doing, then you move out of the realm of exhaustion, you move into tiredness where, okay, take a couple of days off and get some sleep. And that's the way it very much was in terms of Parker Solar Probe, where we had a very tight launch window and a lot of problems towards the end. The team always performed, always came forward, always had solutions, was always positive. And I think it was because they were wholeheartedly invested in the mission and equally important to each other. And that allowed them to perform even well beyond what I expected that they would perform. And as well as myself, you know, the ability to go back to work every day after work weeks like this was something that was unexpected for me. And I also have sort of, at least mentally, traced it back to investment in the project. Next slide, please. Just a note on influence versus direction. This, I could think back over my probably many years of management leadership, and I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I actually gave direction versus influence and influence and inspiration. When you give direction, when one gives direction, one is immediately saying, hey, I know more about this than you do. And I am going to go ahead and tell you to do this. And by doing that, what goes unsaid is I'm taking the power away from you. So direction tends to lead to passive aggressive behaviors. It tends to lead to disillusionment of the team. And this is why, you know, micromanagement is such a frowned on phrase in society, because it does all those things to people. When you influence, you bring people around to a thought process, but you also bring yourself around to maybe a different perspective than you had going into a specific problem. And it's almost under all cases, the better way to act. It's the most productive for a team you want to perform well. and please understand, these two things are different than decision making. Decision making has to be crisp. Sometimes it's not made. Sometimes you don't have all the information. You want to go ahead and someone needs to make the decision. That's different than giving influence and direction. And it also gets back to what I said below, before, is that, if you're up here as a leader or a manager in an organizational structure, and you're making it, giving direction to something, 3 or 4 levels down, chances are you're making the decision to give that direction based on, poor or stale information, particularly if it's a highly evolving situation. So I have spent many hours trying to influence people. Oh, and by the way, influence is hard. Direction's easy, right? Do this, right? You're done. But influence is infinitely more harder, but it's a necessity of managing on high performing teams. Next slide, please. Calmest person in the room, always. These are situations where, where teams are under stress. What you see there, for a quick story, is the nose cone of a Delta IV Heavy, which is what launched Parker Solar Probe. This was August of 2018. You pack the spacecraft up in this nose cone. This nose cone drives at 3 or 4 miles an hour late at night and gets put on the launch vehicle, and then you go ahead and process it for launch. During that trip between Astrotech, which is in Titusville, and the launch site, which is maybe 5 miles away, the air conditioning for the unit broke. And for an hour, Florida air was pumped into that nose cone, which had a cold spacecraft in it. So picture high humidity air being pumped into a body with a cold spacecraft. And I expected this thing to be opened up once it got to launch site to be dripping water. Got woken up at 2 a.m. with this problem, and the blame game started, right? This is even before we opened up the spacecraft. And the only way to diffuse that situation, because that was a potential loss of $1.5 billion, was to stay calm, and keep the discussion away from being personal, and deal with what are really very basic human behaviors, adrenaline responses, fight or flight responses, and try to keep everybody calm. If I felt if I wasn't calm, even though I may not have been inside, that would get broadcast and the situation would have collapsed. And if those of you who have worked in sort of safety critical areas, this is very much the norm. You can't risk being emotional about these things. Next slide, please. We don't often talk about belief in what we do as engineers, but if somebody does not believe something can be done, particularly under high stress environments, the probability of being successful is low. If you have time as a luxury, then yeah, it's, you can change that belief through experimentation into, okay, yeah, I sort of believe, I get it. You can drag somebody along, but that's very time intensive. But if you're in a situation where you've got to execute, I mean, even at sort of the normal pace of work we do, if someone can't believe it's done, they're not going to do it. So believing that a task could be done leads to proving it can be done, and then ultimately executing the task. The Parker mission had some failures of some temperature sensors, and we didn't figure that out until we got to the launch site. And we had to basically rewire, retest, and change software at the launch site within a few months of launch. And if the team did not believe that was possible, we would never have gotten off the first step. Optimism, which is different than belief, is also the driving factor. The fact that you're not pessimistic. If you're pessimistic, you leave yourself very closed-minded to new ideas. So having optimism and belief are critical. And I think that also comes from a healthy teaming environment. Next slide, please. Being human, so admitting and learning from your mistakes. We don't spend enough time talking about what we learned from our mistakes, and these are both personal mistakes as well as professional mistakes. The key, you want to mirror the behavior you expect from your team. You want to mirror in yourself. So if you expect your team to come forward and talk about problems and mistakes they made, you need to be open about them yourselves. If you want to understand an organization, so if you want to understand NASA today, go read about Challenger and Columbia, and NASA's response to those disasters. If you want to understand the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, go learn about the failures of the Mars missions. If you want to understand the Applied Physics Lab, the space sector, go read about Contour, which is that's the photograph in the upper, sort of the mid left of the screen there, as well as Timed and Near. If you want to understand me, Andy Driesman, and how I respond to work, you need to understand the failures that are associated with the three other sets of images on the ground. A balloon releasing and then landing on a swing set, thankfully on an early Sunday morning where there are no kids involved. A bad showing at a critical design review. And then a spacecraft that launched and within 2 days tumbled. Failures that I was involved with, whether having any direct response or not, but having discussions about this and being open about them and openly learning from them is key in team building. There's a certain amount of vulnerability I think we as leaders don't like to show because it makes us seem weak. But you shouldn't expect your team to show vulnerability if you're not showing vulnerability. So I don't have time to go into each of these, but each of these represent a critical behavior I show today because I made a mistake in the past, and I'm open about it. Next slide, please. I love this term, Engineunu. I will credit Michael Paul, who maybe some of you know, with creating it. Engineunu, you see it all the time, right? Where people are using nomenclature or words without tying them to specific facts. Matter of fact, I should write a dictionary definition of it when I get a minute. And it needs to be avoided. We should be making fact-based decisions, and it keeps us static. It keeps us not static, but it keeps us centered. The whole idea is to stay out of reactive mode. The holy grail of a control system, if we want to use that analogy, is forward control, whether it's a PID controller or predictive filtering. And be able to predict the future is what we need to do as managers. So management is simple: be accountable for the past and predict the future, being appropriately responsive to permutations. And so don't use data wisely, I guess is what I'm saying. Next slide, please. I think this has been around the nomenclature for a while, that the difference between data, information, and knowledge. It should say data-driven decisions. You want to use knowledge-driven decisions. data is often can be misleading because it's a bit absolute, where knowledge is more statistical in nature. You're lulled down the path of absolutism when really most of the decisions that are being made are based on a confidence level. I'm pretty sure that this will work. Yet we don't talk about them in those guises because it seems it comes across as a hedge, right? Nor would I even recommend it. I think you have to make your decisions firmly and stick with it, but understand, at least mentally and with your team, that there's only a certain amount of confidence level based upon the information and data that you have. And then lastly, intuition counts. I think that there's much more to a decision than just the data being made. I think we as people and as leaders and managers and engineers get a great deal of insight over our careers that we can tap fairly frequently as we go through life and try to make decisions. You look at a piece of code or it's not structured correctly, intuitively, you could point to that place where where the problem is. When you're making a decision, if your intuition says, the data says this, but my intuition says something else, I would spend a few moments trying to understand why your intuition is not giving you that double check. Historically, if I've gone against a gut reaction of mine, I've usually regretted it. So I do listen to my gut. I do listen to intuition. And it's really nice when the data and the intuition and the knowledge all align. And I feel pretty good with the decision at that point. Next slide, please. Getting towards the end of the talk, leadership is lonely. I like to say it's lonely in the middle because you're never really actually at the top. Everybody has bosses. And the need for mentoring relationship. 3 mentors in my life. The one on the right is my wife. I'm blessed to have married someone who's smarter than me and wise. But people who I've leaned on throughout my career who have nothing other than the rightness of the situation in their mind. So they will, if I'm going down a path, they'll say I'm not going down the right path. So it's not just a vested interest in me, it's a vested interest in doing what's right. And that has helped me center myself throughout my career. I've reached out to these people anytime I've had a major decision to make in life. And I'm blessed the fact that they would typically drop what they're doing and spend time with me to help me walk through it. So develop your networks, develop relationships. When your company has that mentoring day, go either be a mentor. I've mentored many people, and I consider one of the most rewarding experiences I've had. I learn a lot more. I feel like I get more out of it than they do. As well as if you don't have active mentorship and please seek it out. It's only enabled me. Next slide, please. And I think that's my last. So management leadership, it's all about the people. There are big machines we use. There's process control we do. All that is because they're machines and computers. They're more predictable, but ultimately it's the people that drive things. A note for soft skills. This presentation was essentially about soft skills. My experience as a father is equal to my experience as an engineer or as a manager. Being patient with a 4-year-old is learning that is a skill set that I've taken on for years. So pay attention to those. It's not easy. I still don't feel I'm often great at it. It takes hard work, thought, patience, and commitment, work in progress. And this idea of taking care of the caretaker. So those of you who have taken care of elderly parents or a sick loved one, this is one of the things you learn is that, you know, you can't be there for them if you're not there for yourself. So as leaders, we have a responsibility to those people we work with, but that means that we have responsibilities for ourselves. So, and that's often hard because there's an expectation of selflessness when maybe we should be a little more selfish. Anyway, that's the slides. Brandon and I guess Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. We do have some time for questions, and I'll start going down some of the list here and reading them off. So the first question I think was in the context of some of your comments about, you know, in order to understand NASA, you have to understand Challenger and Columbia. And so Chris asks, how do we learn from our mistakes and not default to becoming more risk averse and, you know, accruing more and more things not to do?
I think right. So so the path maybe that Chris mentally has in his head is Challenger and Columbia begot the structured approach that NASA takes to developing programs. And so the first thing I'll say, it's a pendulum, particularly as you get, you know, NASA's responsible to stakeholders. That's basically Congress and the Office of the President. And so they, you know, we all watch the news and they expect a response when, and so the pendulum swings to the right, so say. But I think that I'll use APL as an example, and you may or may not feel it, but when APL lost the Contour spacecraft, it also almost lost the time to and the near spacecraft, where one would argue maybe we got a little lucky, all in a short period of time. And NASA came in and said, "What the heck are you guys doing?" And they came in with a marching army of auditors and really tore at a bunch of things within the organization. APL responded by exactly that, swinging to the right. You know, very hard requirements on how we're going to do things. Yet within a couple of years, it was noted that that was not aligned with what we wanted to be, that we had a strong cultural element, and we were able to swing that pendulum back to the left. So I think this is really where leadership steps in and says, no, that's not the right response. If you couch it as risk, this is risk we're willing to take. The problem with the challenge in Columbia is no one stated the risk that really we're going to take. You know, everybody knew after, you know, 100 of these launches that people are always at risk. But I don't think it was repeated enough, and understanding that launching people on a gazillion pounds of high explosives is an inherently risky business. And finding ways to communicate that risk and bring it down to I want to say a cost of doing business, but that's not what I mean. It's very hard when it's human life, but in reality there is a certain cost of doing business. Take human life off to the side, because I think that falls in a different category, and we need to be expressive about it. NASA is trying to push down into a lot smaller, higher risk spacecraft. They developed a whole new standard, 7120.8. Well, it's not a new standard, but allows for higher risk missions. The test is going to be when one of these things fails, and how does NASA respond? Are they going to succumb to stakeholders, or are they going to be able to work within the political environment and assure that they can continue to take the risks they're taking? Or maybe it'll switch to industry. You know, industry is more willing to take risk. Maybe that's where space is going. The investments in industry, you know, venture capital space has just seen a boon over the last few years. So maybe that's the response, that they'll just rely on industry to do things, find other ways to take risk.
Okay. Next question from Corey Brown. How much of leadership do you think comes from innate personality traits versus something that can be taught or trained?
nature versus nurture. That was sort of a bit of the theme of the talk. That was to the strategic mentoring cohort. I think it's both. I think we have natural predilections, right? So we there is a nature we're born in, and so I think that within the center of the bell curve, you can move, right? You can learn tactics and things to overcome your nature, and enjoy aspects of leadership. Likewise, you can learn things to push down your nature. I tend to be, I'm naturally a directive person. I'm not a patient person. And over the years, I've tried to work on myself to become more patient. So I think it's a combination of both. I do think that at the edges of the tail, so you have personality types that are extremely, I want to use the word introverted, but maybe not fairly, where they would not do well in a leadership role. But you also find that they're self-checking. They rarely push into those. Likewise, you find people who are, and maybe this is the more insidious one, you have people who are trained leaders, right? But they don't have the personality to do it. And those are something that I think maybe we do see more in society than the other type.
Okay. Next question from Forrest Ward. How do you handle a situation requiring decisiveness with a scarcity of knowledge, where knowledge later, perhaps not much later, comes to light that may have altered your original decision?
Flip a coin. It's, you go with what you got, right? So if you're forced into a situation, you could imagine any one of 1,000 different emergency situations where I'm in a house and the house catches fire. I've never been in a burning house. I got to go do something, right? You save the photos of the kid, right? And I think that that's a tough situation, and maybe that's where instinct comes. That your instinct will naturally lead yourself to make the right decision. But we're rarely in a burning house. And I think that's where you reach out to peers and friends and other resources to try to help make the right decision. Ultimately, if it's your responsibility, it's your responsibility. But going out and trying to talk to other people, and even outside your own sort of circle, it would sort of helps. It's interesting. I'm introverted by nature, and I don't like. I'm uncomfortable meeting new people. Yet, I try to do better, and I've recently tried to just network with people because I'm trying to expand some things that I'm doing, and anybody I've reached out to, whether I know them or not, and asked them to go to a cup of coffee, has always said yes. They've always found the time. And so I think that sometimes when we go to ask for help, we assume we're going to get an answer that's no, and that's, I think, rarely the case. So if you have the luxury, seek out advice, talk to others, and add that to your book of knowledge and see where it goes. Other than emergency situations, I think that you can rely on your instinct plus whatever you could glean from others.
Okay. We have time for one more question here from Alan. What are some insights that you've learned during the pandemic or work from home periods? Like, are there any aspects you feel you've learned more about or feel differently about between now and before the pandemic began?
That's a tough question. Let me try a couple things. One is, I guess, about myself is, I really like being in a work environment. I disliked being at home. So for my own personal thing, just being at home has been difficult. I'm not at home anymore. I came back, last April. However, what I've learned is that, if you had asked me 2 years ago, everybody needs to be in the same building for team building. I think that's not the case. I think I've learned that there are many, many different ways to build a team across a variety of platforms, and we need to be more flexible in how we approach things. There's maybe I'm old-fashioned. My eyes on you and in order to understand you. But I think that that's not how much of the world works or should work. So learn that that there are some good things that came out of the pandemic in terms of how we think about workplaces, how we think about teaming, and so maybe there's a more dynamic approach we should be taking towards these things. APL, we're trying to figure it out. We're experimenting, trying to message correctly, making mistakes, working again. So it's still a little bit of work in progress. What we're trying to take is a mission-focused perspective, and then let everything fall out of that. If it means more people working at home or working in Japan and trying to call in, or having a much more flexible environment. I would not have been there 2 years ago. I would have been much more rigid in my thought process.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andy. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all.